intended to be almost a best practices guide, as much inspiration as it is anything else, recognizing that between our organizations, we have multiple thousand members that have each of them a unique business, a unique workplace. So the rules, the guidelines that we set forth in this plan really are not intended to be hard and fast rules that everyone must adhere to by the letter of the law, but instead guideposts that they can use as they craft their own return to the workplace plan. So I'm just going to quickly get into an overview of the document and certainly leave enough time for questions. We started the document off with some fundamental principles, and they are learn, listen, communicate, evaluate, and prepare. Learn, we urge every organization that's reviewing this document to thoroughly review the governmental policies that apply to their workplaces. Listen, we counsel everyone to listen to their employees around their appetite and their circumstances to return to the workplace. Communicate, we encourage everybody to communicate clearly with their employment base and their customers so that expectations are understood about what a return to the workplace looks like. Evaluate, we know that this is a dynamic situation, that the advice we can give today will be better in 2 weeks than it is in this moment. And we encourage everybody to be continually evaluating how they're rolling out their return to workplace plans. And finally, prepare. We are encouraging everybody to prepare their workplaces for the return of employees. And that includes the purchasing of PPE, personal protective equipment, sanitizing workspaces to the extent that can be done. And as they prepare their work plans and their return to the workplace, practicing social distancing. So the document itself is laid out, contemplates 3 phases of the return to the workplace. And these 3 phases mimic or actually track the phases of the plan that was put out by the White House and the CDC task force led by Drs. Birx and Fauci. And the names of the 3 phases are minimal reopening, reopening with physical distancing, and resume to normal. And you will notice that especially in those first 2 phases, there's still an extensive amount of social distancing that we are encouraging in the return to the workplace. And I would even say that with respect to the naming of the 3rd phase, the counsel we've been given by the public health experts that we've conferred with is a resume to normal should not be interpreted to mean a resumption of everything as it was before COVID-19 began. Obviously, the phases get less restrictive as you go, and unlike what you will see in a lot of the plans that come from the political subdivisions and public health departments, we do not offer specific guidelines or data about how or when to move from one phase to the next. Instead, what we're urging people to do, again, is refer to their local public health guidelines and use those guidelines as a way to determine when you're ready to move from one phase to the next. The sections themselves are organized into 5 categories. There are employee guidelines, general workplace guidelines, common area guidelines, travel guidelines, and employee assistance guidelines. And you will see that the specific recommendations are tailored around those specific topics. One thing that I will point out just very quickly, not getting too much into details, but you'll note at the first bullet in each of the phases is a bit of language that we have found very helpful that comes from the CDC. And in the first 2 phases, the language is identical. And it's that you should communicate to all employees that the federal government and CDC recommend that all vulnerable individuals should continue to shelter in place during this phase. These recommendations also state that members of households with vulnerable individuals should be made aware that returning to work or other environments where social distancing is not practical increases the chance they could carry the virus back home. This language is very important for our businesses because it communicates the urgency of keeping those vulnerable individuals apprised of the risk they have in returning to the workplace, but it is short of doing something that we are advising our organizations not to do, which is to tell people that they should not or cannot return to the workplace because they happen to be within those vulnerable employee categories. So with that, I'm really going to turn it back over to the rest of the group and see if anybody else that helped draft this document thinks I missed anything that's imperative. I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions from you all. Thank you.
Scott, great job. I think you nailed it. I think you included everything. So I have nothing. Jessica?
No additional feedback. Thank you, Scott, for a great overview.
Agreed. Okay. John, did you have something to add?
No, I did not.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Well, we'll just jump right into the Q&A. Again, thanks everybody for joining us this morning. Matt Flenner, I believe you are the only person that has a question posted at the moment. So I'm going to unmute you here and to let you go ahead and ask your questions.
Yeah, great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for doing this. Really appreciate it. I have 3 questions that I'd love to see if somebody could answer. Maybe Scott, it's you. How should employers handle employees who feel unsafe coming back to work?
I'll try as best I can, Matt, to answer that question, but I'm going to also look to my CEO colleagues who are on this call, because they may have some reflections given their positions on this too. When we set out the guidelines at the beginning of the document, that communication, evaluation, and listening piece is really trying to get at that very question. There's no one answer I can give you, Matt, on a sort of rote protocol you should follow. But we really think that listening to your employees and understanding if your employees don't feel comfortable returning to the workplace right now, that if they don't have to, they don't have to, right? Just because the social distancing or the stay-at-home order has been lifted, you'll find in the document, we actually think that it's best practice to encourage for some period of time people to continue to work remotely, especially if they don't feel comfortable coming back to the workplace. Tim?
Yeah, Scott, I just might add that, you hit it. It's really about transparent, open, and honest communication and having a relationship with your team members, and you sit down and find out truly what's concerning them. We're all working our way through this, and we have we like to say around our shop, we over communicate. So I think that is truly the foundation for a successful return to the workplace, is making sure, as Scott said, that you communicate openly and very transparently with your team. We are at KCADC are meeting one-on-one virtually with all of our team members and asking these questions and following a lot of these guidelines that the teams from all 4 of these regional organizations have assembled. So it's a great roadmap for many businesses to follow. And just based upon the virtual briefing that we just concluded about an hour ago, there are nearly 700 business leaders on that call. So there is such a thirst for knowledge and direction from so many. So our organizations were trying to fill that void. And again, I give a lot of credit to Scott and Jessica and Diana, certainly Clayton, for all the work that they've done, because they've done the heavy lifting.
As a final thought, I'll also throw in there that this guide also has resources from the Department of Health and Human Services in regards to those HIPAA laws and everything that's come out via COVID. I think there's 4 links in there.
Yeah, and Matt, I might just add, although it shouldn't come down to this, fear of returning to work is not a legal basis for not returning to work. Now, hopefully no employer in the region is going to insist if somebody feels terribly unsafe and going back, but they don't have to do that unless there's some type of underlying diagnosable medical condition that is exacerbated by the fact that the person fears going back to work. But if somebody is asked to come back to work and they simply say, I don't feel safe in going back, that in and of itself is not enough under EEOC regulations for the employee to stay away if the employer insists otherwise.
So then, John, let me press on that just a minute. What should employers counsel their employees to do in that situation? You sort of have a tug of war there. if a employee doesn't feel safe?
Well, I think, one of the things you'll see in the document itself is one of the best practices we're recommending is a virtual one-on-one between the employer and the employee before reopening the workplace. And obviously that's not going to be practical for some of the companies in the region simply because of their size. So in addition to that, I think the secondary recommendation would be that if you don't think it's practicable to do a one-on-one for transparency purposes, you have a questionnaire. Now that in itself, Matt, gets a little bit tricky because you can ask people, for example, if they are in the vulnerable category, but you can't ask them what their vulnerability is. It's simply a yes or no question. And vulnerability under that might be that they are caring for a dependent, an elder, let's say a grandparent or a parent, or they have children who would be at school otherwise, but right now don't have daycare available to them or school available to them, or they're in a vulnerable category in terms of compromised immune system, being a diabetic, some of the other things that the CDC has said, but you can only answer that yes or no. So I think I just echo what Tim said and what Scott said, that you just have to have conversations with the employees and hopefully they feel comfortable, because I think we have to recognize that if you ask any employee right now, are you comfortable returning to the workplace? I suspect even the bravest of the individuals are going to have some discomfort that they're going to mention. I don't think there's any question about that. But if you follow the guidelines and you follow the best practices that are in these programs that are outlined in the work that Scott and Jessica and Diana and McLean have done, then I think you have some reasonable assurances that right now the best practices are being followed. And I think that's all you can do.
Matt, I know you've got a couple of additional questions, but we've got some other folks that would like to ask something. Can we circle back to you on those?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, awesome. So Channel 41, I know you had a question. I think I'm going to ask Joe Reardon to be prepared to answer. If you want to go ahead and read your question.
Yeah, Joe, I was just, you guys talk about how things won't get back to normal exactly the way they were before COVID-19. What trends do you anticipate kind of being permanent changes in the workplace brought on by this pandemic?
Joe, are you still on? There you go.
Sorry about that. Thanks for the question. I think there's a couple things that our organizations, but I think many businesses are starting to discover, which is that for businesses that are able to continue operating remotely, we're continuing to be productive. So I think there will be more of a trend towards the flexibility of allowing employees and individuals to work in a flexible environment, including in a virtual environment like we're holding this press conference in today. I think for many of us, we had probably not done this kind of interactive work in the past. It just wasn't needed, and so we didn't dive deep into it. Many businesses by necessity have, and we're seeing that it has been productive and it's working out. So I think that's one thing that you'll see continuing to be a trend. The second, I think that it kind of follows on to that, and we're evaluating this ourselves today. But we know that even as we get back to something that gets close to normal, that offering virtual convenings to our members, to our customers, in addition to on-site or in-person, is something that we intend to implement for the long haul. That we're going to offer that alternative way to connect with us that we think will be important for our business members and for individuals going forward. So I think those kinds of trends are going to sustain themselves past this period of time, where as the stay-at-home orders are being lifted. And I think that those can be things that can allow businesses to be far more flexible and dynamic than perhaps we were in the past.
Thanks, Joe. Jessica, Paul, did you want to add to that?
Yes. So this time and how